Psychiatric diagnosis subtypes as dynamic. What I want to talk about today is a notion that subtypes of psychiatric diagnoses should be dynamic. The idea that people can change which subtypes they exhibit throughout their life, rather than simply being given a subtype and staying in there throughout their entire life. Instead, they could move between different subtypes over time. Why would you want this? Because causes and symptoms can change over time, and so dynamic subtypes would aim to track causes and symptoms changing over time. The inspiration for this idea actually came from reading history. So I was reading a historical figure who I'll talk about later on, who suggested you could have dynamic subtypes. And I've outlined some of these ideas within a recent paper, although it mainly focuses on other areas than subtypes, it does briefly mention subtypes. So this paper is called A History of Childhood Schizophrenia and Consequences for Autism. It was published very recently in History and Philosophy of the Life Sciences. First question, though, is why subtype? I think the main motive is that currently employed psychiatric diagnoses are very heterogeneous, both in symptoms covered and causes covered. That being, you can get two people who are accurately diagnosed according to the DSM at least, they both fit the DSM criteria of the same diagnosis, and yet they can have some quite significant differences in which symptoms they exhibit and which causes are present. Subtypes could specify more specific populations with more specific symptoms and causes. That would be the main motive of subtyping, to get more homogeneous groupings. So if we had autism and added on subtypes, then we'd hopefully have some more homogeneous groupings. People who fit a subtype would be more similar to other people who fit that subtype compared to people who didn't fit the subtype. Why would you want this? Potentially, it could be better for research, support, and understanding. We can better investigate people to understand what characteristics they have and what causes they have. Through subtyping, we can produce better support that's more tailored towards people through subtyping, and we can understand them better. If you know somebody exhibits a subtype, then you're potentially better able to decide what support they need and understand what they're like. Now, obviously, this depends upon what subtypes are being employed. There are better and worse ways to go about subtyping, but potentially, if we could get high quality subtypes, then these are the sort of benefits that would hopefully follow from having them. I just want to briefly respond to some potential problems with subtypes. Firstly, in relation to autism at least, which is a main diagnosis I study, subtypes, at least from, say, the DSM-3 onwards, 1980s, are typically high-functioning or low-functioning, or at least equivalent notions, say Asperger's syndrome being associated with high-functioning, and today we have notions of severe autism that you might associate with low-functioning. I don't think functioning labels are a good idea. There's lots of potential problems with functioning labels, so the idea is that they're pathologizing, but also I think the idea is that the way in which somebody can function depends upon the external environment. So any subtypes that I think are going to be good aren't going to be purely based around functioning. Secondly, subtypes are arbitrary. There's no clear place to put subtypes onto a diagnosis. Why have one bunch of subtypes rather than another bunch of subtypes? I think a problem with that argument is that you can say basically the same about actual diagnoses themselves. Why have autism as opposed to anything else? There's no clear boundary between autism and lots of other diagnoses. They merge into one another. It's very easy to imagine an alternative diagnostic system which didn't have autism in it, and instead took people who are currently given diagnoses of autism and they get different diagnoses. I don't see that as being any less arbitrary than subtyping. Thirdly, what's the point of subtyping? Why not just go straight to the individual? Why not just try and understand individuals as they are rather than put them into more specific subtypes? Again, I think the problem with that argument is that you can apply the exact same thing to psychiatric diagnoses themselves. Why employ autism when you can just go and look at the person? So if you think it's a good idea to employ psychiatric diagnoses, then to my mind, there's at least potential to also employ subtypes. It's not a case of if you accept diagnoses, then it should be diagnoses and subtypes and look at the person. That's just me briefly addressing some potential concerns over subtypes. The inspiration for this idea came from reading Loretta Bender. Loretta Bender was a child psychiatrist who was active in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And she suggested a notion of dynamic subtypes. Now, the reason for this is because she was taking a psychoanalytical approach. According to psychoanalysis, people have various defense mechanisms, and these defense mechanisms undergo various different stages, and also they can be influenced by the environment. So, whether a defense mechanism activates and how it activates can be influenced by the environment. And for context, yes, this is the era of mother blaming. Things are a bit more complicated than that, insofar as Bender is quite specific that you need biological stuff going on alongside the psychological. She thinks there's many different potential causes can result in these defense mechanisms. It doesn't have to be poor mothering, but yes, poor mothering was on the list. I'm not endorsing that, just to be clear. So Bender has a big list of things that can potentially influence the way in which these defense mechanisms activate, and consequently, given that the defense mechanisms are related to symptoms, then influence the symptoms. So to quote from a 1959 paper by Bender, individual personality type, the severity and time of onset of the illness, environmental and interpersonal relationships, therapy, the various developmental epochs, severe illnesses, and many lifelong processes. For example, she says that if somebody gets a severe illness, then that might influence which defense mechanism they have. They might start off with one defense mechanism, get the severe illness, and then change into a different defense mechanism. Or therapy. Due to therapy, a defense mechanism might stop, or a new one might arise. It's that sort of basic idea. Now, I think this very heavily contrasts with what came after Bender and the psychoanalytical era. So we're talking 1980s DSM-3 onwards. The basic idea there was that people had, I think, fixed causes. If you had the cause, it was going to have its effect. That doesn't mean it would immediately show its effect. It might be only, say, 20 years of age when schizophrenia starts emerging, and it might undergo various different stages. There might be various different stages to schizophrenia, but the key idea is once you've got the cause, it's always going to be there. Whereas in contrast to Bender, causes can change. They can start and they can stop in an unpredictable manner, and also this can be influenced by the environment. I'm not endorsing psychoanalysis. What I'm saying is that sort of dynamic idea, I think, is probably correct, and I'm going to discuss some more recent evidence in a moment. Now, Bender posits 3 different subtypes of childhood schizophrenia. That's the diagnosis which she mainly worked upon, and it's one which has a lot of similarities to autism during the time period. Indeed, in the DSM-3, childhood schizophrenia was removed and explicitly turned into autism in the DSM-3. She posits that there's 3 different subtypes of childhood schizophrenia. Actually, she doesn't use the word subtypes. I think she just more think of these as phases and ways of being childhood schizophrenic, which somebody could move between. Each of them has a different associated defense mechanism. People could change which defense mechanism is present, and so change which phase of childhood schizophrenia they're in. So someone might start off with one type of childhood schizophrenia, and then move into a different type, and then later move on into a different type. I think there's good reasons to think that subtypes need to be able to accommodate this sort of thing. So let's forget psychoanalysis, let's consider modern science. There are notions of causation in modern psychiatry that effectively are dynamic. So things like brain plasticity and epigenetics. So firstly, in relation to genes, genes switch on and switch off, or more scientifically, they start building proteins and they stop building proteins. Whether a gene switches on or off can depend upon a variety of other factors. For example, what other genes there are and what's going on in the environment. Also, brain development can be influenced by what's going on in other parts of the brain. So one part of the brain can depend upon another part of the brain for its development. So if the first part of the brain underdevelops compared to what typically happens, second part of the brain that relies on it might also underdevelop. Alternatively, if the first part of the brain underdevelops, the second part of the brain might overdevelop compared to what's typical. Also, whether a particular part of the brain develops or not can depend upon stimuli. If it's understimulated, it might not develop. If it's overstimulated, it might develop more than it usually does. If it's overstimulated, it might develop more than is typical. And so the environment can affect brain development. Psychologically, the way in which psychology develops can also be influenced by other psychological states. One can causally interact with another. And the environment can play a role in psychology. If you lose your job, you get depressed, that sort of thing. Additionally, all of these can interact together, so genes can interact with brain structures, and brain structures can interact with genes. Genes can interact with psychology, psychology can interact with genes, psychology can interact with brain structures with psychology. So there's lots and lots of complicated causal reactions going on, and they can be influenced by the environment. So here are two quotes to highlight this. So this quote relates to whether genes switch on or not. Here's a bunch of things that can influence this. Biological, chemical, and physical factors such as nutrition, minerals, and weather. Cultural and educational backgrounds and responses to stress, which subsequently influence lifestyles. That quote is from, apologies if I mispronounce this, Abdulmaki, Hi Gallingham, and Wilcox 2005. Also, more broadly, things that can influence brain development, quote, deprivation of normal parental care during infancy, childhood physical maltreatment, childhood neglect, premature parental loss, exposure to family conflict and violence, stressful life events involving loss or threat, substance abuse, toxic exposure, and head injury. That's from Capsey and Moffat, 2006. So the basic idea is lots and lots of things can influence brain development, which in turn influences psychology, and of course psychology can influence brain development, and that then can influence psychology. There's lots and lots of causal interactions, including some that come from the environment. This is a sort of thing which ideally a set of subtypes would at least need to pay attention to. Additionally, symptoms can change over time. So the symptoms that somebody exhibits can change throughout their life. Someone might start exhibiting new symptoms, someone might stop exhibiting symptoms, or they might alter how they exhibit particular symptoms. This can be influenced by many different things, including environmental factors. So, for example, imagine if somebody went to a school that really didn't suit them. The staff and the students weren't very nice to them, they weren't very receptive of their particular way of learning, and then later on they go to a school that is receptive of who they are, and the staff and students are nice to them. That could have a major impact upon what symptoms they exhibit and how they exhibit them. Or, for example, therapy or support, that being active attempts to try and maybe stop exhibiting symptoms or alter how they're being exhibited, that sort of thing. That can obviously influence how somebody exhibits symptoms and which ones they exhibit. And finally, self-conception. Someone might embrace their diagnosis and start exhibiting behaviour they previously wouldn't have, that they'd have previously kept concealed. Or they might say, for example, start masking, or they might actively try and stop exhibiting symptoms. They might try and stop themselves doing particular things. Now, admittedly, in that example, you've got the question of in what sense does somebody have or not have the symptom if they're not actually exhibiting it? That's a different sort of metaphysical question, which I'm not going to discuss here. It's just an example to show how people can change in what the symptoms are exhibiting. So those are three ways in which somebody might change what symptoms they're exhibiting, and all of them can be influenced by the environment. I've also got two quotes here that I think highlight the way in which these changes can occur. Now, both of them relate to severity and functioning levels, which I know aren't popular ideas. I'm just quoting other people, but I think they highlight a potential way of thinking about this. So both relate to autism. Firstly, there is, quote, the possibility of movement within a broad spectrum from low to high functioning through the course of a life. That's by Walsh et al. 2011. And secondly, quote, challenges in social communication and restricted interests, and repetitive behaviours may alter in severity levels across time. End quote. That's by Kite, Gullifer, and Tyson, 2013. So the basic point is that whether somebody is considered to be stereotypically low or high functioning, or to what degree they're exhibiting challenging behaviour or they're finding things challenging, however you might want to think about this, that can change over time. And specifically, it can change due to things like what environment they're in, what support they're getting. So all of these, I think, are potentially relevant. So even if we take the stereotypical subtypes of autism, which I don't think we should employ, there's evidence that they can change over time. That's just not something we really used to think about, even though there's potentially experimental evidence to support this. Whereas I'm thinking about an explicit system of dynamic diagnoses. So my idea is that subtypes should be associated with different causes and different symptoms. But as the causes and or symptoms change, so too do the subtypes. And this can come about due to internal or external changes, stuff going on inside the individual or interactions between the external environment and the individual. So as an example of this, I'm going to again pick some ideas that might not be too popular today, but they're well studied and so that it's something I can easily draw upon. I think the three main psychological theories, the classic ones in relation to autism at least, which have been candidates for subtyping, would be theory of mind deficits, weak central coherence, and executive dysfunction. But experimental evidence suggests that not all autistic people exhibit each of these three, and also the way in which they can exhibit it can be influenced by the environment. So let's take theory of mind deficits, the one which I think people dislike the most. It might be true that autistic people are much more likely to fail theory of mind tests compared to typical members of the population. Does that mean there's a theory of mind cause in their heads that just isn't working or working not particularly efficiently? No, I don't think that's how we should think about causes. Theory of mind effectively should be understood as a term, not a particularly good term. I think there's more nuanced ways of understanding this if we look at, say, inactivist literature, but that's another topic, as a term that effectively groups together a whole bunch of psychological and neurological processes which interact with the environment. These processes can change over time, including when they interact with the environment. The degree to which an autistic person exhibits theory of mind deficits might be dependent upon what environment they're in, what they're required to do in that environment, to what degree the environment fits who they are, to what degree they're getting adequate support. And so literally you could imagine having a subtype for theory of mind deficits, but whether you exhibit it or not, but more importantly, it could change over time. So somebody who goes into one environment that's causing a lot of theory of mind deficits, they're fitting the subtype. Later on, they leave the environment and they spend a significant amount of time in a different environment, they're no longer exhibiting the subtype. That's the basic idea. I think an advantage of this is it helps us to track not just what causes and symptoms someone exhibits, but also helps us track changes to them over time. But thirdly, I think helps us track the way in which the environments can harm people. So I think this fits a broader neurodiversity idea of the environment can affect people who are neurologically different. Because under these subtypes, you can sort of highlight, well, this person wasn't struggling with theory of mind deficits earlier on, now they are. Maybe that's because of the environment. If hypothetically this person doesn't want to have these theory of mind deficits, maybe we should change the environment. That's the sort of thing that I think these sorts of subtypes would help us track. Now, just for clarification again, I'm not saying theory of mind deficits, weak central coherence, or executive dysfunction would be good basis for subtypes. I'm just saying that even in relation to the more well-known classic cognitive theories of autism, we have evidence to believe that these things can change over time. I suspect if we had more sophisticated causal accounts, we'd have even more evidence of these changes. And that's what I hope a system of subtypes would at least try and track to some sort of degree. I'm not saying it'd be easy to have a set of subtypes that accommodated these sorts of changes. I think any subtypes that you posit are going to have strengths and weaknesses, and there's going to be alternative ones that are going to have different strengths and weaknesses. And there's going to be strengths and weaknesses to this approach. And also, it might be often unclear exactly when someone's moved from one subtype to another. There's probably going to be lots of intermediate changes. These are just one way of trying to highlight the way in which people can be and how that can change over time. And I think ultimately is more nuanced than just saying you're autistic. Because ultimately, just saying you're autistic also doesn't highlight the way in which you might differ from other autistic people. Thank you for listening.